So before we get into market failures, just a brief review of what you've been looking at the past couple of days, which are the 4 different types of market structures. So when we're looking at market structures, we're essentially looking at how competitive or non-competitive industries are. And they range from the most competitive and the perfect competition market structure to the least competitive, which is a monopoly. So when we look at perfect competition, remember, this is where we see many firms that are producing the exact same product. Think of any agricultural goods like corn, wheat, pigs, you name it. Those would qualify as working under the market structure of perfect competition. Now, if we're moving to the right along this spectrum, next up is monopolistic competition. They still have many firms like imperfect competition. However, their products are not identical to each other. They're similar, but not the exact same. Think of different restaurants, especially fast food restaurants, different grocery stores, clothing brands. Those would operate under the guise of a monopolistic competition. So they're still competitive, however, they're not as competitive as a perfectly competitive market. Then moving over to the right, even more on the spectrum, is an oligopoly. Now, this is where it really starts to differ from perfect competition and monopolistic competition. Now, their products could be identical or similar. However, there aren't very many firms, there aren't very many businesses that are producing these products. That's what separates them from perfect competition and monopolistic competition. So think of car companies, you could also think of soda companies. These would operate as oligopolies. There's really only a few firms that produce these products. And then on the opposite side of perfect competition is a monopoly. This is where there is one firm that is the only provider or only producer of a product. There are no substitutes or other similar products. Now, keep in mind, monopolies are technically illegal in the United States, but we also have many firms, many industries that actually do operate somewhat like a monopoly, but they are pretty regulated by the government. So, when we look at the 4 different types of market structures, in order for them to be successful, there's 4 conditions that need to be met. We're going to talk about what happens today when these conditions aren't met. So starting with competition, there needs to be competition, if you will, between these different businesses for consumers' willingness to buy their goods. So there has to be competition between firms. Number 2, buyers and sellers need to be informed about the markets. We'll talk about that here in a minute. Number 3, resources have to be free to move. We'll also talk about that today. And then prices of a product should reflect their cost of production. So whenever we're talking about market failures, a market failure essentially occurs when any of these 4 conditions don't exist or any of them are drastically changed or altered in some way, shape, or form. Now, the first factor that can cause a market to fail is a lack of competition. So whenever there's less firms, less businesses, this leads to a lack of competition. When there isn't a lot of competition, think of like a monopoly. There will be high prices and low output. If there's only one firm that is producing, they have the power to control the prices and produce as much or as little as they want to. Now, when there is a lack of competition, this leads to some wasteful, not necessarily spending, but wasteful uses of resource, also known as inefficient resource allocation. So as a way to make sure that there isn't a lack of competition, like we mentioned before, businesses that operate somewhat like monopolies in the U.S., those are heavily regulated to make sure that they aren't charging higher than necessary prices and that their output is somewhat meeting demand of consumers. Now, the second factor that can lead a market to fail is known as inadequate information. So everyone, buyers and sellers, both need to be informed about market conditions in order for us to use resources efficiently. If knowledge is needed for a market to operate successfully, and it's important, however, if that information is hard to find, this is then considered a market failure. Think of someone looking to buy a used car, like we see here. Now, the buyer may think, based on the information that they have, that this car might be worth $3,000. However, the seller might be withholding some information about that car, maybe the fact that it might need a new transmission or that it was involved in an accident in a few months ago, so the seller knows that the value is actually closer to $2,000. So this would be an example of a market failure due to inadequate information. Now, the third factor that can cause a market to fail is known as resource immobility. So when we look at resources, whether it's land, labor, capital, human resources, or entrepreneurial resources, when any of these resources can't or refuse to move to markets where they would be more successful, this also leads to market failure. Think about people who might work at a manufacturing plant and they lose their job when that plant closes. However, they may have a home in that area that was close to their place of work. If they are unable to sell their home and move to a place that has more successful markets where they could find a job, this would be known as resource immobility. The fourth factor that can cause a market to fail is known as externalities, both positive and negative. Now, when we're referring to an externality, this is essentially an unintended side effect that can either harm or benefit a third party that was not involved in the activity that caused it. When we're looking at externalities, we really focus on negative externalities. So this is a harm or cost or inconvenience that is suffered by someone, by a third party, because of actions by others. They have nothing to do with it. However, they are suffering in some way, shape, or form because of actions taken by one or two other parties. Think about people who might have a home near an airport. Now, they may have bought that home 30 years ago, and then within the last 5 years, an airport may have been built close to their house. Now, that has nothing to do with them. It wasn't by their actions. However, now their home value may decrease because they are close to an airport, which obviously causes a lot of traffic near their home as well as a lot of noise as well. So that would be the negative externality those people are facing. Now, a positive externality is the opposite of a negative externality. This is actually a benefit that is received by someone who had nothing to do with the activity that caused the benefit. Some of these people are known as free riders, depending on the situation. So a free rider is when someone benefits from the activity, but they don't pay for it. So when we look at positive externalities, if you think about maybe a school within a neighborhood and that school has gotten really good test scores, they have a high success rate of students graduating, they have students going to really Ivy League schools, that would be an example of a positive externality. So when we look at externalities, these costs and benefits aren't shown in original market prices. That's what makes externalities a market failure, because whether it's a positive or a negative externality, these costs and benefits aren't shown in the original market prices. Therefore, they qualify as a market failure. Another idea to hit externalities home, or a couple other examples, are taking pollution, for example. If you have lived in a neighborhood, let's say for 20 years, and 5 minutes away they decide to build some sort of manufacturing plant that emits a lot of pollutants into the air, that would be a negative externality. Same with vaccinations. If people choose not to vaccinate their children, and then your child or you get sick, that would be an example of a negative externality. You are getting sick not because of your own actions, but because of actions of other people. Now, the last factor that can cause market failure is public goods. So public goods are goods that are used by everyone, and use by one individual doesn't affect the satisfaction or any value for other people. Now, when we look at public goods, you can think of like highway systems, you could think of national defense, police, and fire protection. Those all qualify as public goods. When we look at public goods, governments provide these. Markets do not. That is one reason why they are considered a market failure. Markets will not supply these goods because markets only will supply goods that people will pay for. If you don't pay for it, you won't receive the goods. And goods like highway systems, national defense, it's hard for markets to try to charge one person for using it, but then other people might be using it as well. So it's hard to regulate the usage of those goods, which is why markets don't supply them. Now, when we look at governments supplying these goods, governments necessarily don't always see the need for certain public goods. Keep in mind, in order to use and provide for these public goods, tax dollars must be spent. So governments, when it comes to public goods, might not always use them in the best way.